I wonder if you've ever gone people watching before. Grabbing a seat in a airport or a bus station and just watching the people as they come and go, maybe having a coffee on the street side cafe table and just watching the people as they pass by. And you can tell so many things about them, can't you, as they walk on. Perhaps I should try this one. People watching is an amazing endeavour, and I've done a bit of that in my time. Some people, though, they take people watching to a whole new level, and they don't just watch airports or parks, but they observe cultures and societies. And the person who wrote Ecclesiastes, Kohelet, was someone who was a people watcher, but he took his hobby for people watching to a whole new level. And he watched his culture, and he watched his society, and he observed things about it. And throughout the section that Nathan just read out, he says repeatedly, I saw. He's a guy who is observing so many things. And the interesting thing about Ecclesiastes is that what he's observing is so similar to the world that I observe as I look outside my window and as I look at the world through my various devices. And so Kohelet, the writer of Ecclesiastes, is observing a culture with an uncanny resemblance to the society we have today. And it's a culture which has a lot of dualisms. By that I mean there's things, two things standing in opposition to each other. And I want to look through four of these with you this morning. The four dualities, if you like, that he looks at in his culture, but they are so there in ours as well. The first one is the power-oppression duality. He says, again I looked and I saw all the oppression that was taking place under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter. Power was on the side of the oppressors. They have no comforter. We're becoming increasingly aware, I think, of the use and misuse or abuse of power lately, aren't we? The Royal Commission of Inquiry into the Abuse in Care has highlighted for us so many instances of people being abused when they were really in places where they should have been cared for, dehumanised through the things that were done to them. The report makes for really grim reading. It says the best available estimates indicate that up to 200,000 people were abused in care between 1950 and 1999. Nearly 50 years. 200,000 people abused both in state-based and in faith-based, sadly, places of so-called caring. The abuse was physical and verbal and sexual and psychological. There was neglect. There was racism on a stunning scale. And this, of course, has had lifelong consequences for those who were victims of it. We are well trained, it seems, in inhumanity to other humans, aren't we? UNICEF is a group that looks at the plights of children around the world. And in 2008, a UNICEF report on the abuse of children reported that in that year, 1.2 million were trafficked, 5.7 million were forced into debt bondage or other forms of slavery, 2 million were forced into prostitution or pornography, 300,000 were forced into participating in armed conflict, 600,000 into other illicit activities. The vast majority of them, those 70%, were forced into agricultural work around the world in different places. And a more updated stat, 2023 from UNICEF, indicates that the global estimate for the number of children in child labour at the moment has risen to 160 million worldwide. 160 million, which is an increase of 8.4 million children in the last 4 years. And that's just one category. That's just kids. If you add to that the plight of persecuted females, women around the world, or persecuted faiths, or whole ethnic groups, or persecuted, minorities, it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, doesn't it? And so with all of that, what the writer of Ecclesiastes is saying is fitting so well into our culture as well, doesn't it? And we may agree with him when he says, I declare that the dead who have already died are happier than the living who are still alive. But better than both is the one who has never been born, who has not seen the evil that is done under the sun. And you might go, well, you know what, that's a bit depressing. That's a bit sad. That's a bit defeatist. But on the other hand, I'm going, here's a man who's actually feeling it, right? Here's a guy who is not insulating his soul or his emotions from the world. He's looking out at a world and seeing with eyes open and feeling it in here. Feeling the emotion. Not being insulated or cut off or sheltered from what is going on in the world. And he's in line with James here. Religion that our Father accepts is what? It's pure and it's faultless when it is looking after orphans and widows in their distress. It's the least of culture. The ones who have no help and no hope. Just an updated version of Isaiah chapter 10 where God says, woe to those who make unjust laws, to those who issue oppressive decrees, to deprive the poor of their rights, withhold justice from the oppressed of my people, make widows their prey, and rob the fatherless. And so the challenge I think that the writer of Ecclesiastes gives us here is will we open our lives up again to feel? There's a thing called compassion fatigue. You know, we see it all the time. We get hardened to it. We get desensitized to it. But God never does. God has always been the God who looks after the widows and orphans in their distress and urges his people to do the same. And so the challenge, I think, from this today is let us not guard our emotions. Let us not guard our hearts. But again, go through this week open to a hurting world and letting our hearts respond with a hurt that beats in time. That is the challenge from this duality, I think, for us today that Kohelet sees in his world. Can we do that? What is the place of the church in regaining a heart for the oppressed? That might be a question that we could ponder for a while. How can the church again regain a heart for those who are pushed down? Another duality that Kohelet sees in the world around him is underworking and overworking. He says, in verse 4, I saw all the toil and all the achievement that people have. It springs from envy of one another. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Interesting thing, the way you view work. How do you view work, labour, in your world, in your life? I think we often need a retuning of the way that we see work as a church. When God gave Adam and Eve the gift of work, it was actually a gift. It was their task to continue the creation work of God. We stand in the flow of God. When he was creating the world, he went so far and then he stopped. And then he said, okay, people, you take over. You continue to do creating work in my stead, in my place, because you are my stewards. And all their labours and their creativity and their inspiration and their perspiration was a way of partnering with God and continuing the work of God in the world, which he started by bringing order out of chaos and beauty out of nothingness. And so every time that you write a piece of software code, or build a wall, or teach a child, or bake a sponge cake, you are continuing the work of the Creator God, reordering the world into increasing order. The same thing that God began when he first said, "Let there be." But the problem is that many, even in the church, have lost this vision for their work. Work is a result of sin, isn't it? No. Work predated sin. God gave us work even before sin entered the picture. And what Kohelet does is he looks at a world that has got the wrong view of what work is. And he sees two different roads that people take, which are equally bad to each other. The first one is work motivated by envy. So all the toil and work and achievement is because one person envies another person. The workaholic, the consumer who has to fund their consumption, the one who looks over the fence and wants what the neighbour has. But the problem was, it's worse than that now. And I just love the way this guy, he speaks into our culture so well. In fact, a commentator that I was reading said this. He said it is harder to try and reconstruct the historical context of the book of Ecclesiastes than it is to apply it to our culture today. So well does it fit. Let's look at social media. Social media has created a world in which everyone seems to be living perfect, struggle-free lives. We live in an age of envy. Whether it's holiday envy, house envy, or mum life envy, psychologists and life coaches say social media is increasing resentment. Tauranga psychologist Kate Ferris says she is seeing more and more envy in her consulting room from people who want to keep up with the Joneses and even the Joneses themselves. Our use of platforms such as Instagram and Facebook and TikTok and Snapchat compound, she says, an insatiable wanting. And everyone is accessible for comparison. She says many of us can meet our basic needs, and yet we continue to seek luxurious non-essentials, and the goalposts of what a good life looks like keeps on moving. Social media means we are constantly surveilling ourselves and others and feeding on a diet of curated reality. That's a good line, isn't it? Curated reality. Ferris herself, the psychologist, she's a mum of one. She says she's an ardent feminist and fairly grounded, but even she gets a pang of envy when she sees a perfectly coiffed mum in her stunning home with her dazzling children. Here's another quote for you from theconversation.com. In the past, you may have envied your neighbour when they bought a new car or went on holiday abroad when you could not. Although these feelings of envy would have been perfectly valid, they were isolated incidents that would have lasted for a very short time. Today's world is vastly different as we carry comparison machines around with us in the form of mobile phones. The rise of social media has had many benefits, but also given rise to social media envy when users perceive the perfect lives of others, even though they are rarely as perfect as they seem on the surface. This book speaks to our culture, does it not? Beware the drive for consumption to keep up with everyone else. But this guy also looks at the other road that is equally as bad, and that is those who do not work because they have a motivation of laziness. A little folding of the hands, he says. At the end of 2023 in New Zealand, 11.9% of our working population, 11.9% of our working population who could work were not. That's 24% increase over 7 years from 2017. Many justified? Absolutely. Many who cannot work, but many who can and aren't. And we, know people who have been on the benefit, who now will not take work because they will get less money by working than they will be by getting on the benefit. And they've got kids to support. And so we've created a system and a culture in New Zealand where it does not make sense for so many people to work when they're getting less money to support their kids with. That should not be. It's creating dependency. But it is. It's the reality. Kailot, he looks out on this world and he observes people who are not grasping the vision of work. Verse 5, fools fold their hands and ruin themselves. The phrase translated ruin themselves is actually eat themselves. They cannibalize themselves, is what he's saying, through their laziness. It paints a picture of someone wasting away on the couch because they are too lazy to get up to provide for themselves. I love the writings of a woman called Dorothy Sayers. She's an English woman who wrote stuff. She was writing around the end of the Second World War. She had an amazing view on God's view of work. What she said was this: what I urge is a thoroughgoing revolution in our whole attitude to work. I ask that it should be looked upon not as a necessary drudgery to be undergone for the purpose of making money, but as a way of life in which the nature of man should find its proper exercise and delight, and so fulfill itself to the glory of God. That it should, in fact, be thought of as a creative activity, undertaken for the love of the work itself, and that man made in God's image should make things as God makes them, for the sake of doing well, a thing that is worth doing well. Really good. She goes on, she says this: work is not primarily a thing one does to live, but a thing one lives to do. That's a great way of looking at it. Work is not primarily a thing one does to live, but a thing one lives to do. It is, or it should be, she says, the full expression of the worker's faculties, the thing in which he or she finds spiritual, mental, and bodily satisfaction, and the medium in which they offer themselves to God. That is a biblical view of work that so many of us have lost. What does Kailot say? What does he advise? In verse 6, he says, better one handful with tranquility than two handfuls with toil and chasing after the wind. He's saying contentment with what you have. Work, yes, do work, because that is how you fill a hand, not laziness. But be content with what you have. Find a deep rest, find a peacefulness that is not dependent on looking over the fence, but is dependent on you working because you love working to create new creation in this world as God did. And so the second challenge he gives us this morning: how can Christians model radical contentment in an age and a culture of acquisition? That's a great challenge. He looks out on culture. He sees another dualism, a duality: isolation and community. Again, I saw something meaningless under the sun. There was a man all alone. He had neither son nor brother. There was no end to his toil, yet his eyes were not content with his wealth. For whom am I toiling? He asked. And why am I depriving myself of enjoyment? This too is meaningless, a miserable business. Now, we don't know in the situation whether this man was working so much because he had no family, no community, or if he had no community because he was working so much. We just don't know. But what Kailot is seeing here is someone who is isolated and has lost community and longs for it, I think. And again, the writer just speaks to our culture so much in the present day. Here's an article for you. The number of friends people have. See if this is true of your own life. The number of friends people have peaks at around about the age of 25, but then substantially drops around the age of 30, when work and the nuclear family take over. Americans, especially those who are highly educated and high earning, work longer hours and are more likely to move for work than ever before. Parents also spend twice as much time with their children than previous generations. This saps their ability to maintain close friendships. The last decade has seen a startling further fall in the number and quality of friendships. We have fewer close friends now, research says. Some American statistics. According to the May 2021 American Perspective Survey, 12% of Americans report having no friends. 12% report having no friends, which is up from under 3% in the 1990s. In the United Kingdom, where the number of young adults who report having only one or no close friends jumped from 7% to nearly 20% between 2012 and 2021. 9 years in the United Kingdom, now there's 20% of young adults saying they have no friends, or maybe one. And these numbers are even worse for men, who tend to have more friends early in life but experience a bigger drop-off. Secondly, we are spending substantially less time with the few friends we have. In 2003, there was a study that found, prior to 2013, people spent just under 7 hours per week with friends and around 15 hours when including family and neighbours and co-workers outside of work. But in 2014, people began reporting spending less time. By 2021, the amount had nearly halved. We now spend less than 3 hours per week with close friends and 10 hours with all companions. COVID, of course, has made that worse. So we're living in a culture where people are more and more lonely, disconnected, isolated, starving for community. And that has gone to the church as well. Commentator called Bartholomew said this: much of Western Christianity is privatized religion. Too often the church has succumbed to this privatization. And so the church often fails to be a community. Recovery of community will require a penetrating analysis of where Western culture is at present and the shape of a missional response to it. The gospel is not individualistic. Western culture tells us it is. But we are not saved to be lone rangers. Yes, we are saved individually, but we are saved for community. Does that make sense? We're saved individually for community, as has been said already this morning. So here's a question for you. Could your faith in Jesus, if you have one this morning, continue relatively intact if you were not regularly involved in a community of faith? Ponder that question. Could it survive relatively intact if you had very little engagement with a church, community, or other faith group? And if the answer is yes, that should be a warning sign to us. Because we were redeemed and rescued for community. And even before the church existed, the writer of Ecclesiastes knew that. And he goes through this amazing passage speaking of the benefit of community over isolation. The power of synergy and shared effort, he talks about. Two are better than one because they have a good return for their labour. The power of support If either of them falls down, the other one can help them up. Pity the person who has no one to help pick them up. The power of comfort. So lovely to hear, Robbie, about people reaching out to you when you've been sick. When two lie down together, they'll keep each other warm. How can one person keep warm alone? The power of security. Though one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves. So the third challenge from the writer here is this. How can Christians bring the healing power of community to the lonely and the isolated? Do we need to learn that ourselves first? How can the church be an answer to the starvation of community in the lives of so many people around us? I hope you're keeping track of these challenges. There's one more. The fourth duality this guy looks at is substance and image. I don't know if you've been following the American presidential race recently. It's a 24/7 roadshow, isn't it? If you have been, you'll be reminded again of the power of perception and image. These days, politics, it seems, has less to do with platforms and more to do with personality. We found that in our own election too this time around. Has less to do with policy and more to do with popularity. I talk to young people occasionally. You say, oh, I'll vote for this person because they seem nice. Not really understanding what they stand for, but they just seem cool. And in some ways, it's not the fault of the politicians because they are giving what people are asking for. They're chasing fickle voters. Kohelet describes a situation in his day which doesn't seem too dissimilar, actually. He says, better a poor but wise youth than an old but foolish king who no longer knows how to heed a warning. The youth may have come from prison to the kingship, or he may have been born in poverty within his kingdom. I saw that all who lived and walked under the sun followed the youth, the king's successor. There was no end to all the people who were before them, but those who came later were not pleased with the successor. This too is meaningless. So it seems that he's talking about an actual situation where there was a king that he observed who was unfit for rule because he was stubborn, he'd stopped listening to people, he was stuck in his ways. But there was a young leader who was different. He'd grown up in poverty. He knew how life worked for the poor and the marginalized of his society. He had compassion. He had a unique point of view, but he also had intelligence and wisdom, and he grew up and his name began to spread around as someone that people should listen to. He grew in influence, he grew in power, momentum built. His status grew. And wonder of wonders, when the old king left the throne, it was this young man that people turned to lead them. A huge groundswell of support. And he led them wisely and well, and everyone loved him until they didn't. Opinion turned. It didn't matter what he did. He hadn't changed, but people had gone off him. He was no longer the best, latest, wonderful thing. Not because he'd become a bad leader, but because people were always looking for the next thing. People always think the grass is greener somewhere else. And the writer is looking in his day and his culture on a people who are fickle. People who crave image over substance, the next big thing. And again, the challenge for us is the church different to that. Someone was telling me a while ago of a church looking for a new senior pastor. And my friend was brought in as an advisor to the search team. And he said, I came away despairing because the search team was looking for a candidate full of charisma instead of a candidate full of character. And this is a church who was brought in to image instead of substance. And so the final challenge, how can the church be known for substance instead of chasing image. 4 challenges from a guy who looks at our culture with his eyes open and said, things are not well. Things are broken. 4 challenges for us as the church to say how much of that is reflective of us, yes, but also how can we be a solution to those things. I'd love your feedback during the week. If you have any ideas, flick them in the email to me. Some of the challenges, did you get them all? Did you write them down? Maybe I need to email them out to people. Maybe I'll do that. How can the church regain a heart for the oppressed? That's the first one. Second one, how can Christians model radical contentment in a culture of acquisition? How can Christians bring the healing power of community to the lonely and isolated? And how can the church be known for substance instead of chasing image? Good stuff from this writer of Ecclesiastes. I'd love your feedback. Let's pray. God, we too live in a world that is broken. And so often I think, as I look in my own heart, I am in collusion with some of those things. Father, heal us as your people to be a community that is showing a different reality, living a different way, being a signpost to your heart and your values, and pointing the way, Lord, to something that is so different from what many in our world chase, but so right because it is the path you always meant us to follow. Yeah, some big challenges there, Lord. Maybe not just to simply leave them, but mull over them, and maybe even by your Spirit, come up with some responses. Thank you for the challenge of this morning in Jesus' name.